Karen Allen from PNC. At PNC, we embrace and promote diversity and inclusion as a core element of our values and culture. We are pleased to be the presenting sponsor of today's forum and thank you for your involvement too. It is my pleasure to introduce Jacob P. Kelley. Jacob P. Kelley is a phenomenal sex and sexuality educator, influencer, and content creator. They are a non-binary, queer-inclusive sex educator who has worked in sex-positive and sexual education in rural communities to be inclusive to culturally diverse communities. They are driven by wanting to help people live their fullest and most authentic lives by helping people gain knowledge, awareness, and understanding of one's values. Mix Kelley has their Master of Education in Human Sexuality Education from Widener University and their BA in Communications Studies with a concentration in interpersonal communication and psychology from the Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania. A queer educator, Mix Kelley is a current Ph.D. student studying human sexuality, philosophy, and spent several years developing, researching, learning, and creating content around LGBTQA+ diversity and inclusion. They help people understand where one might hold values regarding their sex, sexuality, and gender. It is my pleasure to introduce Jacob P. Kelley.
Hi everyone, my name is Jacob Kelley and we're going to be talking about gender-neutral language in the workplace. But before I begin, I'd like to just introduce who I am so you can get to know a little bit more about me. My name is Jacob Kelley, my honorifics is Mix, that's MX. But just call me Jake. My pronouns are they, them. I am non-binary. I am currently the Director of Workplace Culture for the Community Action Association of Pennsylvania. I'm also a queer inclusive sex educator with Mix Kelley Queer Education LLC. And I'm a PhD student at Widener University studying Human Sexuality Philosophy. Other than that, I'm a Capricorn if anyone actually cared to know. Going on, within this workshop, I would like to go over 3 different forms of objectives. The first one is just understanding what gender identity is. The second one is understanding gender affirmation language, or what gender neutral language can look like to be affirming to other people. And then lastly, I'd like to just give out a few tips of how we can practice this type of information within our workplaces. So to begin with, gender identity is a very large concept to understand. We all actually have our own understanding of what gender can be. So to get a vague or general idea, so we're all on the same page, I want to define it in these terms. Gender identity refers to a person's understanding and experience of their own gender. A person's identity can coordinate with their sex assigned at birth or not. Just so we're very clear, there is a very difference of what assigned sex at birth is to what a person's gender is. So when we're going in the formation of talking about gender, we want to be very clear that we're talking about gender and a person's gender identity and who they are. Gender identities are expansive and do not need to be confined within one collective agreed upon term. In the workplace, it can be very confusing from time to time of understanding such new forms of gender. When I specifically talk about this in this area, I am talking about members of the LGBTQA+ community or those in the gender diverse communities. We all actually have a growing understanding or representation that has come through both of our media, our personal lives, and our work lives where transgender, non-binary, or gender diverse individuals have come up into our conversations. Hopefully, within our understanding gender identity in this way, we can understand that it's not necessarily a conversation that we can tell someone who they are, but they're allowed to be who they are in our workspaces. Which brings me to my last one. There is no one authority that dictates the boundaries of gender except the individual's own gender. It's an understanding that I'd like to just say that identity is not identity. So when we think about people's identities, that is theirs. They're allowed to be who they are, come into our workspaces and anywhere that they go. It is our jobs related to being in the workplace where we actually have to understand that they are coming to us. Yes, they have to represent us, but how well do we actually let our communities be diverse? How well do we act in choices of equity? And how do we be inclusive within these spaces? So what to keep in mind related to gender identity is everyone has a gender. Everyone has the right to identify who they are. A person's perception of another does not define another's person's identity. That third one's kind of a little bit confusing if you think about it, but in what we have to say is when we look at a person, sometimes we have the perception of their identity already in mind. Really, what we have to do is challenge that internal bias right away and make it a gender neutral understanding or an affirming understanding, because if we've never met a person, we are actually always putting our implicit biases on someone. And in this factor, we are putting on how we see someone and what gender they could or could not be. So a person's perception of another does not define that person's identity, because again, it is identity, not you-identity. And then lastly, gender is not the same of a person's assigned sex at birth. So a lot of times when we fill out those forms, when we're doing things related to filling out when hiring somebody or on one of those employees' applications, we always have different terminology on there. So we have to ask ourselves, are we asking what a person's assigned sex at birth is, or are we asking what a person's gender is and why? So that really just comes down to one of those practices that we'll get to in later. But keep that in mind when we are thinking about a person's gender identity. It's not for us to tell anyone who they can or cannot be. It is them who tell us, and we have to be able to be the professionals in the room that say, we will respect you. So how do we respect people? Through gender neutral language. The best thing to ask when you're doing gender neutral language is, are we being inclusive within our language? This is an understanding and statement that language matters. The words and choices we use to represent populations, groups, and individuals really does impact depending on what we say. And in this statement, gender neutral language is actually a form of language that can be inclusive to everyone in the room, specifically if we don't know who's in the room. So first, I'd like to just define what gendered language is. So gendered language are words in which imply a gender to the person or a role at hand. So a lot of the times, this is our roles, our titles, pronouns, honorifics, and greetings. A lot of the times, which I'll get into examples here shortly, gendered language is specific in making sure that the language we use does actually relate to a person's gender, whether we know it or not. A lot of people I've worked with say they grew up just knowing these are the words that we use, not actually understanding like there's a form of gender that is behind these type of terminologies. Where do we use this gendered language the most? Common day, everyday language. It comes habitual. We also have it in our policies, and sometimes we have it in our signage and signs that we have in the workplace. And then lastly, we do sometimes have it in our documentation and files as well. However, how do we make, why is gender neutral language so important? So when we look at gendered language, communication within itself is restrictive to who is being representative. Also, gendered language places an assumption on other people based on how they present or express themselves, which limitates and puts a bias on that person before they even walk into the room. And then lastly, gendered language can also bring assumptions to a person other than their identities that are not gendered. So a lot of the times there are different cultural values within gender that are the intersexualities or intersectionalities of people that sometimes our gendered language is actually making reference to other forms of their identity that we may not know about. So gender neutral language, when we look at why it's important, gender neutral language actually allows communication for all people within the room to be included. It takes that restriction of way of who we are actually talking about, since we actually want to talk about everyone in the room. Gender neutral language also limits assumptions, implicit biases away from people. So we're not actually making the assumption of who we know a person is, because we're talking in at large or more of a neutral base. So we're taking the gender forms out of our language and really just talking about the person or the people. And then lastly, gender neutral language can create an environment that can be more inclusive. In the workplace, the action and choices that we make when we talk about inclusion can then result into belonging. And if we're here to try to tell people that they're allowed to be in our workspaces, that means we're also telling them that they belong here as well. And it's just a form of how we create that language using gender neutral language. So examples to what gendered language is within gendered neutral type of language. So if we look down this list, we have policeman, police officer, salesman, salesperson, fireman, firefighter, manpower, workforce. Hi guys, a very general greeting that a lot of people do. How about hello everyone? ladies and gentlemen, welcome guest, so on and so forth if you go down this list. The importance to the gendered language, as you can see, it's not just the language, it's our roles and titles we have on there. It's the greetings that we have. Gender neutral language actually takes certain power dynamics outside of the norm of what gendered language is, meaning a lot of gendered language is structured in a form that there is a hierarchy of power. Specifically, if you look at police man, it's not police woman. So that's a very common form of dynamic. So when we think about gender neutral language, it affects all people in how we are represented, not just those of the LGBTQIA+ community, but it also can. More examples just to get on the dynamic of what gender neutral language can be. So one of the ways is like addressing large groups and audience. When we say, hi everyone, hello all, welcome guest. My favorite, I like to use hi y'all, but I guess that gets, depends, people will find out where I'm from if I say y'all a lot. Drafting communication, so a lot of times when we're typing emails, right? So we go, how do we say hello, sir or ma'am? Maybe we're saying hello there. Dear valued customer, or hi team. Addressing specific audience members. So this is, we need to call out or call someone up for participation instead of saying young man, young sir, young woman, person in the blue shirt, right? So we're using descriptive messages, right? So for me, I'm wearing a teal button up, that could be a sign in which someone has. Maybe they have a nice haircut or glasses on, so you can call out within the descriptive factors in that way. And then casual conversation. So, a lot of times in the workplace, we find situations in where we're just having casual conversations saying, like a lot of times family relationships, if husband and wife comes up, maybe we can say their partner or spouse since we're not necessarily sure. Pronouns. This has been a really big topic. I actually have a lot of conversations around this specifically in the workplace, but pronouns are just one aspect of gender neutral language. However, it is a big aspect because pronouns are the words that take place of addressing a person without the use of their name. Why is it important? Because when I say why is it important to use the proper pronouns within individuals? Because it's a way to respect another person. You can create an inclusive environment by making sure you are taking the time to address the proper pronouns for everyone there. And like using a person's name, we want to be respectful by using their pronoun because that pronoun is what's taking place of their name. So if we're going to go out of our way to make sure you're learning a person's name, we should also taking the time to learn that their pronoun. I will say I could do a whole lecture on or presentation on pronouns alone, but I will say that pronouns, a person can have more than one pronoun, right? So it might not just be they, them, like myself. A person could have she, they, or he, they, or they could just use all pronouns. And there's also other forms of different pronouns specifically to gender. So the reasoning why someone uses that pronoun isn't necessarily something we actually need to know in the workplace unless we want to have that conversation. The important part to knowing pronouns is that we are actually taking the time to respect and listen to a person on who they are and what they would like to be referred as. In this list here, she, he, they, and they is at the bottom. These are very common pronouns. They and they are actually gender neutral pronouns. And I always encourage people, if you haven't met someone yet, use the form of they and them pronouns until you actually get to know or find out what their pronouns are. One of the best ways to find out a person's pronouns is just simply ask. What happens if you've made a huge mistake, meaning you used the wrong pronouns, you referred and you had an implicit bias and just made a huge assumption about someone and you just don't know what to do? Simple. Acknowledge it. Say sorry, move on, and go forth within what you need to do. If you're a bystander within that situation, the thing that you would actually want to do are two things. You can either pull that person aside and say, hey, that's not this person's pronouns, that's not how we address them, this is how they would be preferred. Or you can call them out in the situation and within that group and just say, hey, that's their pronouns, continue the conversation and move on. It does not have to be a long process. It can be a 2-second thing. Within that time frame, we want to then practice. The individual who did make the mistake, you don't just want to stop there, you want to continue to grow and learn. Because if you don't, then it forms into a microaggression, which is where we get into the understanding that you are constantly misgendering an individual instead of taking the time to learn, which can also be harmful and disrespectful constantly within the workplace to an individual. With all that being said, what practices can we have in the workplace? So you can create a diversity, equity, inclusion policy. This is typically a policy that is a statement or an equity type piece that allows people to know that they can be who they are in the workplace, and they will actually be supported by their leadership team. You can have a non-discrimination policy, which is different than a diversity, equity, inclusion policy. A non-discrimination policy typically should already actually be in your workplace policy. A lot of the times it's in our employer equal employer opportunity policy, but it could be something else. It just depends on what your workplace has. Update your policies. A lot of the times we have the phrases of she or he as a statement within there. Why can't we put it as they, or just a person, or a staff member, or whoever we're actually addressing and meaning for it? If a person's gender does not need to be in the statement, then we don't need to necessarily put it in there. Create a workplace roundtable discussion and have more than just your leadership on there. Sometimes getting to know your staff members in these roundtable discussions can be a time where we build our team and actually get to know the people, so people can start feeling more comfortable when you do have an open door policy, when you do need people to come in, and when you need people to be heard. Provide optional places for pronouns. So this can be in your email, your Zoom name, business cards, ID badge. Allow people to have that option if they come into the workplace, such as a person like myself. I do like to have my pronouns in as many places as I can, so I'm addressed accordingly. So I don't have to always go out of my way and go, my pronouns are not he, him, I appreciate you. They're actually they, them. And that actually takes some of the burden off of that practice if we allow those options. Therefore, I can actually already go in and see that my workplace cares about who I am as a person, and I'm valued. Invite speakers into the workplace. Have different people represent. If we're really not sure, bring people in. Have that open conversation. Have people listening if you have the opportunity to do so. Provide educational opportunities such as this conference, trainings, or even seminars. Update documentation to have options for more than 2 genders. You can easily do this depending on if they're internal documents. Go in and have option that's not just other. You do not want an other option. You want to have an expansion option. You can even have an option your gender. So that way it's inclusive to everyone. You can even ask people their pronouns. Maybe if they're applying and you have to interview them, have on your form before you interview them, what are your pronouns? So during the interview process, they can be addressed accordingly. And then lastly, normalize talking about gender neutral language. This isn't an understanding that we have to constantly bring it up as a main topic, but we're using it in our everyday language that it just becomes nature and natural for us. A lot of the times we don't actually think about what we're actually saying, we kind of just say it. But if we take the time to relearn why words matter, why our language matters, we can get to the point that gender neutral language just becomes our normalized form of language. And then we kind of already automatically create an inclusive space within what we're already doing. So to recap, we explained what is gender identity. Everyone has a gender identity, and it is identity, not you-dentity. Understanding gender affirming language. So gender language is restrictive, and gender neutral language is affirming and inclusive to all. And then practices in the workplace. Open a conversation, accepted, included, or welcomed in your workplace is a very good question to have and a good place to start. My name is Jacob Kelley. I am with Kelley Career Education. I am also the Director of Workplace Culture for the Community Action Association. My email is here, and if you would like, you can visit my website at juicywithjake.com. Thank you.